All right, Shabbos, good evening, and let us begin. So we have a lot to do tonight. So we're doing three things tonight. Number one, we are finishing up the Makomos from last week. That's the first order of business. We left off at source number 16 from last week's shir. So we're going to finish up the last couple of Makomos. That was Kotzer, part 2. And then Emir Hashem, then we're going to move on to Kotzer, part 3. Finish up Emir Hashem the malacha of Kotzer, and then Emir Hashem b'sha'at tova Melachos. We're going to begin another malacha of M'amer, of gathering tonight. So all happening in the course of the next 40 minutes or 45 minutes. Emir Hashem b'sha'at tova Melachos. So both say, let's continue first with source number 16. So remember again, we were speaking about in number 16 from the Sefer Hilchos Shabbos. He quotes over here a very interesting idea, a very interesting case. So remember, we've spoken about the idea, obviously, that part of the din d'Rabbanan, the gzera d'Rabbanan of Kotzer, is not being able to utilize a tree. Right? We saw, again, you can't use the tree directly. We saw tzadin, tzidei ha'ilon last week. The only thing that's permitted is tzidei tzadin, 2 steps removed from the tree. So what about the interesting case about the following situation? So imagine, again, you're walking home from shul, and what happens? Your hat blows off and lands on a tree. Hat blows off and lands on a tree. So what should one do in such a situation? If you don't want to use the hat as the accessory, you could fill with it. You could, whatever it is. Your yarmulke falls off, right? Your scarf falls off. An article of clothing falls off and falls on the tree. So take a look at number 16. The footnote over here, right? Something very interesting. It says, Ulam nira, degami nema delekicha meila negufa ishtamshos. So remember again, the concept ultimately, again, of going ahead and utilizing a tree or taking something off a tree. Let's remember again, we saw this in last week's shir. Excuse me. The interesting distinction as to what was the nature of the prohibition of removing something from the tree. Is removal from the tree considered to be active usage of the tree? Or maybe, again, removal from the tree is just something lest you come to lean on the tree and actively utilize the tree. So he writes over here something very interesting. That even if you say that removing something from the tree is actual usage, let's say for argument's sake that's actual usage, he says, K'moshe Kasav Rashi v'Arashba Mikol Makom Af L'Dido Hainu Dafka M'Makaven L'Chach. So this is actually very interesting. By the way, if you don't have the sheets, I didn't print out extra copies, but it's on the chat. It's still on the WhatsApp chat from last week as well. I'm sorry, I should have printed out additional copies. My apologies. So even if you hold that halacha l'maisa, that removing something from the tree is considered to be actual usage of the tree, he says that's only if what? That's only if that's your kavanah. It's only if you're kavana. He says, "Shemechin tzarchei hashab b'shelo ba'ofen sheyitztarich likach me'a'ilon da'az halakicha chashiva shtamzush." So, for example, what's the issue? If I put something on the tree before Shabbos, and I know, I'm sorry, and I know that I'm going to have to use that item. I'm going to need it. I know. Should have brought enough for the whole share. Right? There's tea later on. I'm good. I just have to thank you. And I know that I place something on the tree. I know that I'm going to have to take it off the tree on Shabbos in a way, ultimately, again, that is going to require me to use the tree. That's where taking something off the tree is considered to be a bona fide form of hishtamshus. I set it up so that by definition, I'm going to have to end up utilizing the tree. However, he says, in this case, he says, "Aval kishe isrami shelo birtsono sheparcha taliso al ilan verotze lachzir alav bazeh lo kosvo harashi varash bakein demator elis lo mea ilan v'yoser hayanoach lo ilo parcha ala ilan." So this is fascinating. So when do we say that removing something from a tree is considered to be usage of the tree? That's when it was placed on the tree b'kavana. Right? You place it on a tree b'kavana, now you want it off. This is part of a premeditated act. However, he says something very interesting. He quotes over here the idea that if something blows onto the tree, removal from the tree is not called hishtamshus. It's not called usage of the tree. Why? Because if it was up to me, I would have rather the item not blown on there to begin with. And therefore, halacha l'maisa quotes here, and it's really quite interesting that halacha l'maisa, if your yarmulke, your hat, your scarf blew onto a tree, blew onto a bush, because it doesn't have to be a tree, right? It's any growth from the ground that is lamala megimel tfachim. That's what's subject to this halacha. So your yarmulke blows off, it falls onto a bush. Can I take it off the bush? So he posits over here that the halacha is absolutely yes. you can take it off. What about hishtamshus? What about if you go with the approach that removing something from the tree is considered to be hishtamshus from the tree? It's only hishtamshus if it was placed there bekavana in a premeditated act. But lamaisa, because it was not placed there, but rather, again, as far as you're concerned, you would have rather it was never there to begin with. Removal is not considered to be hishtamshus. Interesting idea. Yes?
So, I don't know, remember my question about the chumash?
The chumash, yes.
On the tree branch or something?
Right.
But let's say you put it on there. You didn't premeditate it, put it on there. You just set it down there. You weren't thinking about it.
But and that's still called for this halacha premeditated. That's still called for this halacha. In other words, premeditated just means you had kavanah to put it down, as opposed to in this case where clearly I didn't have any kavanah at all.
So if it was going to rain, what would your answer be?
Cover it up. Cover it up with something. Don't take it down. That would seem to be the halacha in that case.
Okay.
Yes.
What if someone else that you put your thing on the tree and you want them to, or you know that they will?
It doesn't seem to make a difference. It's not a din in you. It's a din in the usage of the tree. It seems the halacha is that if something was intentionally put there, then by definition there's an issue to take it off. But if it just blew on there, and I don't think it matters who put it on there, but if it blew on there like this case, that's where it'd be at the heter. But just as an aside, by the way, just as an aside, I don't think I mentioned this last week, but obviously we know also, what about the following case? So this is a case where I was wearing my yarmulke, it blew off. What about the following case? What I was saying that was on the tree and ultimately was blown off the tree and now is off the tree. So let's say, Matt's chumash case. I put the chumash on the tree and then the wind blew off the chumash. Can I pick up the chumash? Well, chumash is probably not the best idea because kisvei kodesh on the ground is going to be something different. But whatever, I put an object on the tree. The wind blew it off. Am I allowed to go ahead and now utilize that object? So remember again, this goes back to a concept we actually learned in Hilchos Muktzah. Right? In Hilchos Muktzah, we have the concept that when something was set aside for non-use during Ben Hashmashos on Shabbos, Ben Hashmashos at the onset of Shabbos, it retains that identity throughout the entirety of Shabbos. So halacha l'maisa, if something was on the tree during Ben Hashmashos of Shabbos, even if it subsequently blew off, it is still going to remain asur for use. We're going to see this. Where does this come up? What's going to be the most notable case of this? You have an apple tree, and what happens? An apple blows off the tree on Shabbos. So are you allowed to go ahead and eat that apple on Shabbos? So we're going to see the halacha is no, right? Why is the halacha no? Because it's muktzah, because since ben hashmashas, it was attached to the tree. Remember again, the muktzah identity of any particular item is concretized ben hashmashas. Zevi, what's wrong? I'm sorry?
That's muktzah or no?
It's not nolad because it was there. It was there.
Apple
was on the tree. It's not nolad. Why would it be nolad? I don't think it's nolad. Right? I can make it even better. It's a fully grown apple that doesn't even need the tree anymore. Right? But by Pashtos, it's going to be muktzah because miko diskatzoi. Okay, take a look at number 17. Another application of this halacha. Hados mechuber. If you have a hados, what's the English? Myrtle branch, right? Myrtle branch, mutar la'ariach bo. So listen to this. You have a myrtle tree. You go over to the myrtle tree. You want to smell the hadasim. You're allowed to. Shulchan Aruch paskins, you can smell it on Shabbos. However, aval esrog v'tapuach v'chol davar lachila. But any item, like he gives the example of an esrog or an apple, that is fit for consumption, asr lahariach bo mechuber. You are not allowed to smell it while it is attached. Why? Sheme yakutz oso liachlo. We are concerned lest you come to go ahead and what's going to happen? You're going to smell the apple. It's so delicious. And just inadvertently, what's going to happen? You're going to pull it off. You're going to pull it off and want to eat it. Okay, so both sides. So really interesting distinction. So really the way the Shulchan Aruch says is this issue of smelling something fragrant only applies to food items. You can't do it if it's a food item, lest you come to detach it. Non-food items, you are permitted to smell for their fragrance. Take a look at number 18. So the Mishnah comments on this and he says, Mutar lahariach to lo shayich lemigzar shema yakutz. Mishnah says, why aren't we concerned? Why aren't we concerned that what? Maybe halacha l'maisa again, you're going to come to detach. You're going to come, you can actually even take a few back. I'm sorry, I meant to place some more back over there. Why aren't we concerned that maybe you're going to come to detach the myrtle branch? So he says over here, Keva shen rotze rak lahariach, so we'll say the whole chap with the hados, what's the only thing you're doing with the hados? The only thing you're doing it, You're smelling it. That's all. There's no other use. So therefore, by definition, there's no chashash that I'm going to come to detach it, since the only use of it is for fragrance, and I could be nana from the fragrance scent while it is still attached. He goes on, he says, V'yesh machmirim bazeh. Others are machmir with this. And others are machmir. Others say, you can't smell anything that is attached to the ground. So I will say, on Shabbos is the one time in life, do not stop and smell the roses, right? So this is machlokes. Yesh machmir bazeh. V'kasa b'Eliyah Rabbah, da'ikar kipsaka shulchan aruch. So we'll say, ultimately, the Eliyah Rabbah, however, says, you don't have to be machmir. You don't have to be machmir. That halacha l'maisa, you are allowed to smell something that is fragrant but not edible, but not permitted to smell something that is edible and detached. So we'll say, and this is how we paskin halacha l'maisa. The Rabbi says, we go to the psak of the Shulchan Aruch, so you can smell the flowers, you can smell the myrtle branches, but you can't smell the apples or smell another food item.
And you have a pot of roses that are outside in the front, and then it's been replanted into ground. I mean, obviously,
yeah, it still has the same halacha. Same that just because something is replanted, it still retains its same exact halacha. Yes,
There's an apple that you described, like ready to eat, that you come upon under a tree. Do you have to assume it fell off on Shabbos, or could you pick it up and eat it?
Oh, so we're actually going to see that. Baruch Shekivanta. That was a great lead-in. Okay, we'll say that is the end of Kotzer part 2. Now with Avi Shaila, we're going to go to Kotzer part 3, which is only just a couple of Mamakomos. It's only 6 Mamakomos. It's the first page on your source packet over here. So we'll say, here we go. So Avi, we're going to come back. Actually, I don't know why I put it this way, but we're going to come back to actually Avi's case in just a moment. First, a little bit of just a detour. Take a look at number 1. Shulchan Aruch writes as follows. Shulchan Aruch says, let's go out of order. Let's keep it going with the fruit. So take a look at number 4. Right. So now we've established Shulchan Aruch paskind halacha l'maisa. You can smell, let's say hadassim, flowers, right? Other things like that, non-edible items. Since you're only utilizing it for fragrance, we're not considering it to detach it. You cannot smell attached fruit or vegetables. Why? Again, logical concern. You may come to go ahead and detach it. Now, let's take a look at number 4. Peiros shenashu min ha'ilan b'Shabbos. What happens if fruit fell off of a tree on Shabbos? Right, like Avi's case, I'm walking in my backyard, or I'm walking anywhere, and what happens? There's an apple on the ground. So am I allowed to eat it on Shabbos or not? So the Shulchan Aruch paskins that fruit that fell from the tree on Shabbos, asurim bo bayom, they are asur that day, ula'erev mutar miyad, and at night, ultimately, again, the fruit is immediately permissible. Take a look at number 10. Why are the fruit asur? He says, mishum shemayala v'yitlosh v'gam mishum muktzah. So the truth is, Mishnah Berurah says there's really 2 reasons why the fruit that fell from the tree is going to be asur. Number 1, I will say, we get to the general idea that we are concerned that if we allow you to go ahead and consume detached fruit from the tree, then what's going to happen? You may come to go ahead and actively detach fruits from the tree. So it's gzeira. Now, I'll say, what's interesting is, and you find this a lot of times in Hilchos Shabbos, is like multi-levels of gezeros. Right? That kind of dinah, these are all dinah d'Rabbanan, but yet interestingly enough, they all pile one upon the other. So therefore, number 1, you can't eat the fruit that fell off the tree, lest you come to consume another fruit, lest you come to detach other fruits from the tree. That's number 1. Number 2, the Mishnah Berurah says, there's a muktzah issue. Like this is what we just mentioned before. What's the muktzah issue? Once something was attached to the tree throughout the duration of Ben Hashmashos, right, the twilight period of the entry of Shabbos, whatever you are, Ben Hashmashos, that's what you remain for the duration of Shabbos. So therefore, if the apple was attached to the tree over the course of Ben Hashmashos, even though it subsequently falls off, it was established as muktzah and removed from use for Shabbos. So therefore, halacha l'maisa can use the haya az mechubar. So since again ben hashmashos, it was attached to the tree. Therefore, is katsoy l'kulei yoma. It is set aside for non-use for the entirety of the rest of Shabbos. So therefore, I will say. So therefore, two reasons why the fallen apple will be prohibited. Number 1, gzeira shemiya'ala v'yitlosh. You may go up and detach it. And number two, a muktzah issue. Now, both say. Now, take a look at number 6. Now, to Avi's question, which is, so now I come upon the apple. Now, both say, let's go through this, right? It's Shabbos afternoon, or Shabbos, whatever, Shabbos after davening, I'm coming home, I see an apple on the ground, right? Now, again, here's what I know. I know the apple's not on the tree. What don't I know? When did it fall off? Now, I will say, now, obviously, if it fell off on Shabbos, it's going to be awesome, right? So that we've already established. But there's also the possibility that it fell off before Shabbos. I don't know. I wasn't in the backyard before Shabbos, so maybe it fell off before Shabbos. So now we have a suffix. Now we'll say, now again, it would be tempting to say, how do you resolve this halacha? B'pashtos, it should be a suffix d'Rabbanan l'kula. But again, Hilchos Shabbos has all types of chumras built into it. Take a look at number 6. Perosh sh'nishru va'afilu im suffix shema nashru b'Shabbos gam kein aser. Now we'll say, now what's interesting is the Mishnah brings down, even if it's a suffix, did the apple fall down before Shabbos, on Shabbos? That's still going to be asr as well. Seif Rabbo say, therefore, in the wide world of fruit, here's what we have. So number 1, I can't smell attached fruit or vegetables. That's number 1. Number 2, even if the fruit falls off on Shabbos, it's still going to be asr. Why? 2 reasons. Number 1, if we're concerned, if we allow you to eat it, you may come to what? Detach additional fruit. Number 2, what's number 2? Muktzah issue. Right? Migu des katzoi. Since it was muktzah at the onset of Shabbos, remains muktzah. And even if halacha l'maisa, it's a suffix. Did it fall on Shabbos? Did it fall before Shabbos? I still can't eat it. Gezerah, ultimately, again, gezerah, lest you come to pick it off the tree. Yes?
Someone accidentally puts their hand actually on Shabbos and then the wind blows it off. Would it be muktzah? I mean, because it wasn't something in Shmashos, but maybe say Yahweh.
Yeah, it would still be that any time you put something on a tree, even though again it's quote unquote accidental, in other words, but you did it. In other words, there's a direct action. Then halacha l'maisa, you can't. You're saying on Shabbos and now it blew off.
On Shabbos, then the wind blew it off. So now it's on the floor.
Yes, it's mutar.
But you don't say Shem Ya'aleh v'yitlosh?
Not in that kind of case. There's Shem Ya'aleh v'yitlosh, because remember, Shem Ya'aleh v'yitlosh applies to produce, where technically speaking, if you detach it, it's an Isser D'Oraisa. Shem Ya'aleh v'yitlosh would not apply to items for which there would not be an Isser D'Oraisa. Right? So in other words, remember, the worst case scenario is if you put your hat on the tree and you went back and got your hat afterwards, you're over on a din d'Rabbanan. Once the hat has been blown off, it's totally mutter to pick it up. Right? The din of being prohibited to pick something up after it's blown off the tree is only a din by produce. Only by produce. Good. But let's go back to number 1.
Suffix fell on Shabbos or not? Suffix d'Rabbanan. Is there a specific reason why there are more machmir on this?
Hilchos Shabbos, you find multiple examples of suffix d'Rabbanan l'chumrah. Yeah, I guess it's just the formulation of Hilchos Shabbos that even d'Rabbanans are, not always, but very often d'Rabbanans are dealt with l'chumrah.
No, here you can say it's a negotiation material. It's a muktzah block of Shabbos.
Yeah, but you can say that with almost anything on Shabbos.
Sorry?
You can say that with anything on Shabbos. Right? Then you can use right. But I'm saying, but technically speaking, anything that's also on Shabbos is going to be mutter Matzah Shabbos. But maybe. Take a look at the morning. We'll say one more application of Kotzer. Then we're going to make our siyum on Hilchos Ktsira. So take a look at number 1. Another application. Ein roch b'na gabe behema. You cannot ride an animal on Shabbos. V'lo nitlim ala, nor can you hang anything, or literally you can't hang on the animal on Shabbos. Haga. So we'll say, what's wrong? What's wrong with the usage of the animal on Shabbos? So besides the idea that there is a din of shrisas behema, of allowing your animals to rest, which we'll talk about, the Shulchan Aruch over here discusses the concept that you're not allowed to ride an animal for another associated reason as well, which is, look at the Mishnah Berurah number 2, Ein rochbin, gezerah shemayach toch zemura mina mechuber, kadei lanhiga, dechayev al zem mishum tolish, dehu tolda de Kotzer. So here it is, fascinating. So why can't you ride an animal on Shabbos? Because halacha l'maisa, again, we're concerned in general when you're riding an animal, what do you need? You need like a little stick or something to go ahead and lead the animal. We're concerned that if we let you ride an animal on Shabbos, you may come to detach the stick to go ahead and use it to lead the animal. Fascinating. So the next Mishnah Berurah number 3, he says, V'lo nitlim aleh, T'chol shimush b'balei chayim klalo bechlal rechiva v'asru v'afilu demleka lemecha shema yichtoch zemura. Shabbos says, so this is interesting. So halacha l'maisa, the Mishnah Berurah says as follows. any type of usage with animals on Shabbos is going to be aser, right? Why? Lest you come to break off the branch. Now, and this is to your point, even in a case where there's no concern you're going to break off a branch. What's a case where there's no concern you're going to break off a branch? He says, Kigon b'midbar telecha zimura o l'shav shefesatino kagai v'hem kedei l'shasheo so gam kin aser delo plug rabbanon b'mil sayu. So we'll say, so even in a case, ultimately, again, where halacha l'maisa, you're not going to break off a branch. You know, his case over here is where you want to calm down a baby. So you kind of just want to let it bounce it on the animal a little bit. Still, you can't do that either, even though, again, I'm not going anywhere. But l'maisa, again, any hishtamshus, any usage, ultimately, again, with an animal on Shabbos, is going to be aser alt this gezerah of Kotzer. Now, if you go back up to number 1 for just a moment, so it's interesting that Amma adds in over here, it says, Haga va'asr leishev al karon she'ini Yehudi manhigo b'Shabbos mishum shemishtamish bebehema gam shelo yachtoch zimora. So we'll say, so it really is interesting to see how far the dinei d'Rabbanan. Here the Rama says, you can't go in a wagon that's being led by an animal, even if a non-Jew is leading the animal. Right? Why? Because what you begin to see, Rabbi say, is included in this din d'Rabbanan, ultimately, is any usage of an animal on Shabbos. Yeah. I'm sorry? So, right now, we're focusing on Ktsira. It's Kotzer. It's Kotzer. Any use of an animal may lead you to break off a branch. That's what we're focusing on. Shvisas we're going to deal with separately in Meretz Hashem. But right now, our focus ultimately here is because of Kotzer. So, what's interesting over here is, remember, the use of the wagon, almost, like, if you think about it, almost seems like tzidei, right? Or tzidei tzdadim, right? But halach l'maisa, any use of the animal ultimately is going to remain prohibited, al katsira, yes.
What's the hashkaf behind the law too?
I think it's the chumrah of Shabbos. Well, in general, lo plug d'Rabbanan. Well, because legal systems have to work with blanket assumptions. In other words, you can't start making halacha that selectively applies here, doesn't apply over here. So if the Rabbanan are going to make a halacha, it applies to every case, even if technically speaking, your particular case does not conform to the reason they made the halacha. And by Hilchos Shabbos, we see even a more general application of this to be even on multiple levels of the Rabbanans. So we'll say, Shkoyach, that is the end. So we did 3 parts in Kotzer. Shkoyach, that is the end of the Malach of Ktsira. We'll say again, I know that these early Malachos in Hilchos Shabbos are not as exciting as typical Hilchos Shabbos. But again, remember, the great part about this is, or learning these Malachos, that people often, yes, Ami?
Just to be clear, like an actual farmer, does they have to lock up all their animals on Shabbos?
I mean, you don't have to lock it up per se. No, so that's not a problem. In other words, any malacha that gets done by an animal of its own volition is not a problem, right? The animal relieves itself and thereby fertilizes the field. That's fine. That's fine. It's just, again, I just want to point out there's a secondary malacha over here, shvisas beima, of not allowing your animals to work, which we're not focusing on right now, right? But we'll get to that in Meretz Hashem. So I was saying, I know that these malachas aren't necessarily, not all of them have the same lemaisa applications, but again, remember, let's keep our eye on the ball. The goal is in Meretz Hashem in a couple of months from now, when we're finished with all 39 malachas in Meretz Hashem, a couple of months in Meretz Hashem. So, again, we will have seen literally again from one end to the other in Hilchos Shabbos a very rich thing. So we'll say with that, we move on to the halachos of M'amer. So we'll say this is the second page in tonight's handout. So, shir number 1 in M'amer. We'll probably have to do this week and next week as well. So here we go. So we always start with the Mishnah. So the Mishnah, Masechah Shabbos, Ayin Gimel and Dalet, Avos Melachos Abraham Chaser Echad. There are 39 malachas. So we'll say it's exciting because now we can kind of go through and begin to see everything. So we've already done Zoreah, Choresh, Kotzer. So again, Baruch Hashem, we're 3 down already, and now we're up to Malacha number 4, M'amer. So we translate M'amer ultimately as gathering. So where was gathering? Where was this malacha done on the Mishkan? So once again, Rashi points out to number 2, Aval kulhu kamaisa havi b'samemanim shal tseva tcheles v'argamon v'tolaas shani. So Rashi points out over here, we'll say, where was M'amer? Where was gathering done? Where was gathering done? Same place that Zoreah, Choresh, and Kotzer was done, which according to Rashi was what? For the herb. Now, for the herbs. Yeah. For the plants ultimately, again, that would be used to create the dye. We also see other Rishonim will say, would indicate where else was Ma'amer done? For what? I'm sorry? Gathering wood. Good, we're going to talk about that actually. We're going to talk about that. But again, it's Pashup Shayim, before we get into gathering wood, Lechem upon him. Right? Remember again for the bread. Obviously, again, for bread, you need wheat, you need flour. So obviously, all of these malachas would not have just been done for the dyes, but would also have been done for the production of the lechem hapanim. Good. So we'll say, let's begin tonight in number 3 in a really incredible piece about the Chai Adam. So this is an important Chai Adam because the Chai Adam really outlines the parameters of this malacha. It's not going to be the full parameters, but at least allows us to get started. So here we go. Number 1 says the Chai Adam. Ein imor ela b'gidulei karka. Now we'll say, some of these things we're going to talk about a little more because some of them are somewhat contested. But right now, we'll just go with the Chai Adam as he's espousing it. Number 1, Ma'amer only applies with things that grow from the ground, right? Which makes sense. Because halacha l'maisa, that's where it was done in the Mishkan, right? Gidulei karka, either the herbs, the spices, the dyes, the wheat. So number 1, only Gidulei karka. Next, so what is the malacha of Ma'amer? What is it? He says, Shema asef shibalim o peros o eitzim b'makom gidulan. So we'll say this is fascinating. What's fascinating about some of these malachas, we'll say, is we don't necessarily ever hear of them because lav davka that you come in contact with them on a regular Shabbos. Listen to this. What's the malacha of Ma'amer? The malacha of Ma'amer is taking produce, things that grow from the ground that are scattered. Now, where are they scattered? They're scattered in the very place that they grew, and you pile them up. You gather them up to put them into a pile. That is the malacha of Ma'amer. So the example he gives is tivua. Both sides. So what happens with wheat? Right? You take your sickle, you harvest your wheat. What happens after you harvest the wheat? What happens after you do that? Right? So it's on the ground, right? But it's scattered. So what's the next step? After Kotzer, what do? Right? You gather all the wheat together into a pile. That act of gathering and putting it into a pile, that is called Ma'amer. So in order to violate Ma'amer, what do you have? Number 1, Gidulei karka, has to come from the ground. Number 2, the piling is done in the very place where the object grew. This is very important about say. So we'll see. Well, he goes on. He says, Aval, shelo b'makom gidulan, afa pishen Gidulei karka, mutar lekabtzan. Now, let's say, interestingly enough, you could gather things together and put them into a pile if you're doing so not in the place where they grew. I'll give you a perfect example of this. So let's say, again, just keeping with the wheat motif over here, right? If you cut down wheat, you go ahead and you put it in your storehouse. So now you have wheat piled scattered all over the place in the storehouse. The act of gathering the wheat in a pile in the storehouse is not ma'amer. It's mutter. Says the Chai Adam. It's mutter. Now, why don't you say, come on, this seems to be ripe for a gzer drabanan, right? That we should say, we don't want you to gather it in the storehouse. Lest you what? Gather it in the field. So the Chai Adam says something very, he says, Delo asi lemiti lahatir apamakom gidulan, de makom b'makom lo machlif. And I will say, people do not confuse areas. In other words, that there is so much of a distinction between the field and your storehouse. No one will come to equate that which you do in your field with that which you do in your storehouse. Makom b'makom lo michlaf. Really interesting idea. So therefore, again, Ma'amer is Gidulei karka, grow from the ground, and number 2, only gathering or only piling in the place where the object grew, where it grew / was harvested. But elsewhere, no malacha of Ma'amer. Incredible. Therefore, he says, so we'll say, listen to this case. So imagine for a moment, you're holding a bag of apples on Shabbos, and you drop the bag of apples, right, and the apples scatter on the kitchen floor. So you could say to honey, I'd love to help, but you know what? I wish I could. It's okay, you could do it. It's okay, it's fine for you, right? But for me, it's not. So we'll say, so therefore the Chai Adam says, Ma'amer doesn't apply like that. Right? Why not? Because it's in your house. The malacha of Ma'amer is only in the field where the object grew. He goes on, he says, V'nosen afilo soch asal, Ube'inyan delonis arev ba'afar tzoros, da'az asr mitam borer. Okay, so you leave that aside. Aval, so the Chai Adam brings in a couple of other interesting cases, which we're not going to get into right now, but bottom line, what we emerges from the Chai Adam will say is, number one, Ma'amar only applies to Gidulei Karka, that's number one. Number two, it only applies, gathering or piling only applies in the place where the object grew, and number three, it does not apply anywhere else. I will say that number three is very big. Why is it very big? Because again, we would have instinctively thought that of course you cannot put something, you can't gather something into a pile, ultimately again in your storehouse, lest you come to do it in the field. But again, Chai Adam says, makom b'makom lo michlef. People don't confuse spaces. Okay, let's go back there. Number four. So we'll say along this idea of Gidulei Karka, because this is going to be a little bit of a contested piece over here. So again, the Gemara Masechah Shabbos goes Abaye, Amar Abaye, ein imur elo b'Gidulei Karka. So we'll say, so again, where does the Aruch HaShulchan get this from? What's interesting also about M'amer is, what's interesting is so many of the halachos about M'amer are not mentioned explicitly in the Shulchan Aruch, which is also quite fascinating. We'll get into this a little bit more next week. So Abaye says that halacha l'maisa, halacha l'maisa, M'amer only applies to things that grow from the ground. So let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah in 5, 6, and 7. In each of these seifim, the Mishnah Berurah is going to highlight a very essential point. So number 5. He says as follows. He says, "The Melachos M'amer lasav hashibolin v'gamu ke'ein zev v'davka b'makom hamisharfo sheshamu makom yidulo shal melach dumya tishman shabasada." Aval, this is the last line is what I want you to focus on. Aval im nispazer b'makom acher mutar lekamta l'makom acher. So I'm just showing you that the principles espoused by the Chai Adam are not just the Chai Adam, but they show up in other sources as well. So here the Mishnah Berurah says, so number one, you have the Gemara telling me that it only applies to Gidulei Karka. Items that grow from the ground. Number two, the Mishnah Berurah tells me it's only an issue of gathering if we're talking about the place where the objects grew. But if the objects are not placed somewhere else, there is no problem gathering them into a pile. Beautiful. Source number 6. Mishnah Berurah himself again says now, Hainu Peros, V'Yerakos, V'Eitzim, V'Asavim, V'chol davar hagadol min hakarka, ubazeh chiyuva nami'ika, kishemekamtza mokom gidulan, dezeh Melachos M'amer gufa. So what was I here? The Mishnah Berurah saying, Gidulei Karka. So just pointing out again, Mishnah Berurah is just espousing the same principles as the Chai Adam. Chai Adam says Gidulei Karka. Mishnah Berurah number 6 says Gidulei Karka. Chai Adam said ultimately only gathering in the place where they grew. Mishnah Berurah number 5 said only the place when they grew. Now take a look at number 7. This is interesting. He says as follows. He says, Harizeh told us M'amer, Shedarkan shall also peros lechabron ba'ofen zeh. Now listen, here's what's interesting. Now why is it that the malacha of M'amer only applies in the field? Why is that? So Mishnah Berurah says because that's the normal way to perform the malacha. Right? We'll say in general we have this concept that one is only chayiv for malacha if it's done in the normative way. Right? If you do it in a non-normative way, that's called what? Non-normative performance of malacha? A shinui. And once you have a shinui, it's already downgraded to a different level. So the Mishnah Berurah says the reason why the malacha of M'amer only applies b'makom gidulan is because that's how M'amer is done. That's how it's done. Now watch this. V'ayin b'nishmas adam shemetzaded da'af kisha'osekim babayis chayiv mishum M'amer. Now, the Nishmas Adam is dealing with the following case. So what happens if, for example, you have something where it is common to gather it inside the home, just as common as it is to gather it in the field? So I'll say, interestingly enough, the paradigmatic example of this in the poskim is dried figs. What would you normally do with dried figs? What would you normally do with them? You string them together. Now, what's interesting is it was very common to string together figs inside the house. So the Nishmas Avraham says that in that kind of case, one would be chay for M'amer even in the house. So again, it's logical. What it's saying is, under normal circumstances, the reason why M'amer of gathering only applies in the field where the object grows is why? Because that's how it's done. Right? And when we say that's how it's done is, that's the only way it's done. Right? But say, just if you understand like wheat, think about this for just a moment, right? You don't take wheat, throw it in the storehouse, and then pile it in there, right? Why not? wheat is very often, at least in Eretz Yisrael, the agriculture, wheat is often left in the field to dry. Right? You don't want to put wheat that has moisture in it in the storehouse because then it rots. So it's common to pile produce ultimately in the field. And therefore, if you pile it instead in your home, that's not the malacha. All the Nishmas Avram is pointing out to us is if you have the type of produce that is normally piled inside of the home, that Einachinami, you'd be chayv for M'amer in that type of situation. So again, I don't know, but dried figs is the example that's brought down by all the poskim. So I don't know, but whatever else would fit into that paradigm would work as well. So we'll say, so take a look, 8, 9, and 10. With this, we're gonna finish up for tonight. Just as this is just an interesting aside, a fundamental machlokes about M'amer achar M'amer. Meaning, what happens in the following situation? Imagine for a moment, I go ahead and before Shabbos, I cut down my wheat, and I gathered my wheat into a pile. And now what happens? Now on Shabbos, a big wind comes and scatters the wheat. So now, obviously, I'd like to put the wheat back, ultimately again, where it was. Or wheat may not be the best example because wheat technically could be muktzah because it's not usable, but whatever, a pile of fruit. And then a wind comes and scatters the fruit. Am I allowed to regather it? So we'll say this happens to be an interesting machlokes amongst the Rishonim and the Achronim regarding is there M'amer achar M'amer not? In other words, do we say that once something has been gathered, so that's it, it's already gathered, and it's no longer subject to the malacha of M'amer anymore, or maybe not. Maybe once it's been gathered, if it scatters again, there is once again a malacha of M'amer. So both say, I just want to point out to you, we're not going to really do it inside. This is a machlokes between the Meiri and the Arzarua. The Meiri paskins that ein imor achar imor. Right, the Meiri paskins, again, neither of them say it explicitly. It's more inferred from their respective positions. But the Meiri holds that there is no imor after imor. Right, once you've done M'amer, that's it. Even if the pile subsequently separates, there is no prohibition of gathering it back again. And the Arzarua paskins, yes.
This means only in the place where you initially did it, though, right? We're not talking about we brought it into your...
No, because essentially once you brought it in, and you want... Totally fine. Again, you might run in, with certain types of produce that's not edible, you might run into muktzah issues, but no M'amer issues. Once you bring it inside, no longer subject to M'amer. It says, Dafka b'mokom gidulan. And we'll say the Arzarua holds, Yesh imor achar imor. That ultimately, again, it is subject to the prohibition of piling, even after you've done it once before. We'll say, how do we paskin? So the consensus of the poskim, is really what's brought down in source number 10, is that we are machmir to hold yesh imor achar imor. So what this would mean is if you had a pile of produce that was piled before Shabbos, and then a big wind came and went ahead and separated out, right, blew apart the pile, you would be prohibited to repile that on Shabbos itself. Yeah?
Well, what about salt? Like when you're jigging with the salt.
So we're going to talk about non-gidulei karka things in Mirat Hashem, or what's the definition of gidulei karka? We'll get into that more next week in Mirat Hashem. Yes.
Regathering the initial hana because you're preparing to transport it after Shabbos. You wouldn't be able to transport it without that.
I don't know. Maybe I want some of the fruits. I want to gather it together. I want to utilize it. I mean, the answer is it could be, but I think also there's.
Maybe that's why it's Yesh M'amer achar.
Yeah, no, he just holds, no, he doesn't bring down a din of achana. He just holds, again, the fundamental shaila is, once you go ahead and you do M'amer once, do we say essentially, that's it, it is M'amered, or that, and that's it? Correct. So this is not, it's not a unique machlokes. Just pointing out, I will say, but I just want to point out that Allah myself, we are machmir on this. And we hold yesh imor achar imor. And therefore, Allah myself, if you pile something, so we'll say, so you pile, again, you have a vegetable garden in your backyard, I don't know, whatever. So the particular type of vegetable that you pile up before you bring it inside, and then the wind comes and blows it apart, Allah myself, you would be prohibited to regather that on Shabbos itself. Chad, what were you going to say? Oh, excellent. So actually, I'm going to get to that next week, but I'll answer it now. 2. In other words, in order for something to be called a pile, you need at least 2 items. That's...
My follow-up to that was also going to be like, is there a way to bring it closer without considering
Oh, good. Hold on to that next week, Emir Hashem. But let me just end off with one last piece, just in the few moments that we have. Shabbos say, just in general, there's an interesting discussion about what constitutes M'amer, right? So what is gathering? How do you perform those? So Chat already got into it. I'm going to get into it more next week, but the shear of the Malacha is 2 items. What about the mechanism? I'll give you an example. Remember we learned Hilchos Muktzah, right? Muktzah, the only issue with Muktzah is what? Tiltul biyadayim. Right? Technically speaking, if you want to kick a Muktzah object, technically you can. Right? The only issue of Muktzah is actually moving something with your hands. But halacha l'maisa, moving it with your foot is technically not a problem. So what about M'amer? How is M'amer done? So also what's interesting is, and this is quite intuitive, M'amer is done anyway that it's normally done. Right? So that's the answer. So for example, the poskim bring down that it's common, let's say, to gather small twigs, right, with your foot. So therefore on Shabbos, if you were to go out, and I will say, by the way, I just want to point out, sometimes people do these kinds of things without even realizing it, right? Just like, whatever, you're standing around. So the act of kicking twigs together into a pile, ultimately, again, would be M'amer. So that would be with your foot, right? Fruit, it's common to roll fruit, the post can bring down. So essentially, the mechanism through which you go ahead and violate M'amer, ultimately is however the particular item is normally gathered. If it's by hand, then it's by hand. If it's by foot, both, either way. All right, we'll say, on completing Melacha of Kotzer. We'll stop it. We're going to spend 1 more week in Eretz Hashem on M'amer, and then in Eretz Hashem, after M'amer, we get into Dash, Borer. That's where the real party is going to start over there in Eretz Hashem. I'm sorry?
I think we already mentioned
Yeah, I just have to send it. I have it. I just have to post it. The Bechina is going to be on Zoreya and Choresh. We're going to do 2 at a clip. Great to see you. All right, 3 days in a row. Right? That's right. Did we see each other on Shabbos? Matzah Shabbos. Okay. Good. Just it. Yes, I'm going to send that out. I'm going to send it out tomorrow morning in Hashem.
Is like rocks or sand, is that considered?